Maria Santos had never imagined that her morning walk through Central Plaza would change her life forever. The 32-year-old schoolteacher from the outskirts of the capital city had come to the plaza that Tuesday morning to buy fresh vegetables from the market vendors. She wore her usual simple blue dress and carried her grandmother's woven basket, the same one she had used for grocery shopping since she was a teenager. The plaza was busier than usual. Word had spread that the royal family would be passing through, on their way to the cathedral for the annual blessing ceremony. Hundreds of people lined the cobblestone streets, many holding small flags and flowers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal procession. Maria found herself swept up in the crowd, pressed between excited families and curious tourists. As she made her way toward the vegetable stands, she noticed the heavy presence of royal guards. They stood at attention every few meters, their red uniforms immaculate, their rifles held at precise angles. These weren't ordinary soldiers but elite members of the Royal Guard, handpicked for their loyalty and training. Their faces showed no emotion as they scanned the crowd with practiced eyes. Maria had always felt uncomfortable around authority figures. Growing up in poverty, she had learned to keep her head down and avoid trouble. Her father had been arrested, twice for speaking out against government corruption, and her mother constantly warned her children to stay invisible when officials were around. But something about this particular morning felt different. Maybe it was the arrogance she saw in the guards' expressions, or the way they pushed elderly people aside to make room for the royal convoy. The trouble started when Maria witnessed something that made her blood boil. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, had stumbled while trying to get a better view of the approaching procession. His walking stick clattered to the ground, and he began to fall backward into the crowd. Instead of helping, the nearest royal guard shoved the old man roughly with the butt of his rifle, causing him to cry out in pain and confusion. The crowd around them pretended not to see what happened. Maria watched as people turned their faces away, too afraid to intervene. The old man struggled to get back on his feet, his dignity shattered, while the guard smirked and made a crude comment about keeping the riffraff in line. Other guards nearby chuckled at his joke, as if the suffering of an elderly citizen was entertainment. Maria felt her hands shaking with anger. This wasn't right. This wasn't how people should be treated, especially by those sworn to protect them. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, telling her stories about the old days when communities stood together against injustice. Her father's words came back to her too, about how silence in the face of cruelty made everyone complicit. Without thinking clearly about the consequences, Maria pushed through the crowd toward the fallen elderly man. The royal guard who had shoved him was still laughing with his colleagues, apparently proud of his actions. His rifle was held casually now, no longer at the ready position. The safety was off, and Maria could see his finger resting near the trigger guard. This detail would become important later, though she didn't realize it at the time. The guard noticed her approaching, and his expression changed from amusement to annoyance. He was a tall man with cold blue eyes and a thin scar running down his left cheek. His name tag read Lieutenant Morrison, and Maria could smell alcohol on his breath despite the early hour. This wasn't unusual among the royal guards, who often drank to cope with the boredom of ceremonial duties. When Maria reached the elderly man, she knelt down to help him retrieve his walking stick. The old man looked up at her with grateful eyes, but she could see fear there too. He shook his head slightly as if warning her to stay away and avoid trouble. But Maria had already made her decision. She helped him to his feet and turned to face Lieutenant Morrison directly. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even the other guards stopped their conversations to watch. The royal procession was still several blocks away, but its approach could be heard in the distance, the sound of horses' hooves and ceremonial drums echoing off the stone buildings. Lieutenant Morrison stepped closer to Maria, using his height and uniform to intimidate her. He expected her to back down like everyone else always did. After all, he represented the crown, and she was just a common citizen. In his experience, a stern look and the presence of his weapon were usually enough to make troublemakers disappear back into the crowd. But Maria didn't step back. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes and spoke in a clear voice that carried further than she intended. Her words would later be repeated throughout the city and eventually reach the ears of people in the highest levels of government. She said simply, "You had no right to hurt that man. He's done nothing wrong except try to see his own king." The lieutenant's smirk widened. He had dealt with countless civilians who thought they could challenge his authority, and he had ways of putting them in their place. What he didn't know was that Maria Santos was not like the others. She had spent years teaching children to stand up to bullies, and she had inherited her father's stubborn streak when it came to fighting injustice. The confrontation that followed would shake the foundations of the Royal Guard system and expose corruption that went far beyond one drunken lieutenant's abuse of power. But in that moment, as Maria stood face to face with Lieutenant Morrison while hundreds of people watched in silence, neither of them could imagine how dramatically their lives were about to change. Lieutenant Morrison's face darkened as Maria's words hung in the air. No civilian had ever spoken to him like that, especially not a woman in a simple dress who clearly came from the working-class neighborhoods. His grip tightened on his rifle, and Maria noticed his knuckles turning white. The other guards moved closer, forming a semicircle around them, their own weapons ready. The crowd began to murmur nervously. Some people started backing away, not wanting to be associated with what looked like a developing incident. Others pressed closer, drawn by the rare sight of someone actually confronting the Royal Guard. Among them was Carlos Mendez, a freelance journalist who had come to cover the royal procession, but found himself witnessing something far more newsworthy. Carlos quietly pulled out his small digital camera, keeping it hidden inside his jacket. He had covered enough protests and civil unrest to recognize when a situation was about to escalate. His instincts told him that whatever happened next would be significant, and he positioned himself where he could capture it while staying relatively safe. Lieutenant Morrison leaned down toward Maria, close enough that she could see the bloodshot veins in his eyes and smell the whiskey more strongly. His voice was low but menacing as he spoke. "Listen here, little lady. You don't seem to understand how things work around here. I suggest you take your shopping basket and disappear before you find yourself in serious trouble." Maria's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Every rational part of her mind screamed at her to apologize and walk away. But something deeper, something that connected her to her father's courage and her grandmother's wisdom, kept her feet planted firmly on the cobblestones. She looked up at the lieutenant and said, "The only person in trouble here is you if you think you can abuse innocent people." The lieutenant's smirk vanished completely. In one swift motion, he grabbed Maria's arm with his free hand, squeezing, hard enough to leave bruises. His intention was to drag her away from the crowd, probably to a nearby alley where he and his colleagues could teach her a lesson about respecting authority. This was their standard procedure for dealing with troublemakers, and it had always worked before. But as Lieutenant Morrison jerked Maria forward, several things happened at once. The elderly man she had helped suddenly found his voice and shouted, "Leave her alone, she was only helping me." His words seemed to break a spell that had kept the crowd silent. Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of disapproval that grew louder by the second. More importantly, Maria's reflexes kicked in. Years of working with unruly teenagers had taught her how to break free from someone trying to grab her. As the lieutenant pulled her forward, she twisted her body and yanked her arm back with surprising force. The sudden movement caught him off guard, and he stumbled backward, loosening his grip on his rifle. In that split second, as the weapon wavered in his hands and his balance shifted, Maria saw an opportunity that would haunt her for months afterward. Without thinking about the consequences, acting purely on instinct and adrenaline, she reached out and grabbed the rifle barrel, pulling it away from the lieutenant's startled grasp. The crowd gasped collectively. Several people screamed. The other guards immediately raised their weapons, creating a deadly standoff in the middle of the plaza. Carlos Mendez captured the entire sequence on his camera, including the moment when Maria Santos, a simple schoolteacher, disarmed a member of the elite Royal Guard in full view of hundreds of witnesses. Lieutenant Morrison stood there for a moment, looking at his empty hands in disbelief. Never in his 10 years of service had anyone even attempted to take his weapon, let alone succeeded. The rifle felt strange and heavy in Maria's hands. She had never held a gun before, and the reality of what she had just done began to sink in. The weapon was a military-grade assault rifle, loaded with 30 rounds of ammunition. The safety was still off, just as it had been when the lieutenant was carrying it. Maria's finger accidentally brushed against the trigger guard, and she nearly dropped the rifle in panic. She could see the fear in people's faces as they realized she was now holding a loaded weapon in a crowded public space. For a terrifying moment, nobody moved. The royal guards had their rifles trained on Maria, but they couldn't fire without risking hitting innocent bystanders. Maria held a weapon she didn't know how to use, surrounded by armed men who were trained to kill. The crowd was trapped between them, too frightened to run but unable to help. Lieutenant Morrison's shock quickly turned to rage. Being disarmed by a civilian was the ultimate humiliation for a royal guard, especially in front of so many witnesses. His career would be over if word of this incident reached his superiors. Worse yet, the royal procession was getting closer, and the sound of approaching horses meant that high-ranking officials would soon see the chaos in the plaza. "You have no idea what you've just done," Morrison hissed at Maria. "Give me back my weapon right now, and maybe I can convince my men not to shoot you where you stand." His voice shook with a mixture of anger and desperation. The other guards looked to him for orders, unsure how to handle such an unprecedented situation. Maria looked at the rifle in her hands, then at the circle of weapons pointed at her. She could see children in the crowd, families who had come to witness a royal ceremony, and instead found themselves in the middle of what could become a massacre. The elderly man she had tried to help was crying, begging her to give back the gun before someone got hurt. But even as fear overwhelmed her, Maria noticed something else. Some people in the crowd weren't looking at her with terror. They were looking at her with hope. For the first time in their lives, they were seeing someone stand up to the royal guards who had terrorized their neighborhoods for years. They were seeing proof that these supposedly untouchable enforcers could be challenged. The sound of the royal procession grew louder, and Maria realized she had seconds to make a decision that would affect not only her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. She could surrender the weapon and likely face arrest, trial, and imprisonment. Or she could do something even more dangerous, something that would expose the corruption she was beginning to suspect ran deeper than one drunk lieutenant's abuse of power. As the seconds ticked by, Maria made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of pointing the rifle at Lieutenant Morrison or his men, she carefully turned the weapon around and held it by the barrel, offering the grip back to the lieutenant. But she didn't hand it over immediately. Instead, she spoke loudly enough for everyone in the plaza to hear her words. "I'm returning your weapon, Lieutenant Morrison, but first I want everyone here to witness what just happened." This man pushed an elderly citizen to the ground for no reason except his own amusement. He was going to drag me away from this crowd to punish me for speaking up. Is this the kind of protection the Royal Guard is supposed to provide? The lieutenant reached for his rifle, eager to end the embarrassing standoff, but Maria pulled it back slightly. "I'm not finished," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want to know why you smell like alcohol while you're on duty protecting our king. I want to know why your fellow guards thought it was funny to watch an old man get hurt." Carlos. Mendez continued filming, realizing he was documenting something historic. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the plaza about the confrontation. People who had been shopping or working in nearby buildings came to see what was happening. Among them were several off-duty police officers, city council members, and even a few low-ranking government officials who had arrived early for the royal ceremony. Lieutenant Morrison's face was turning red with anger and embarrassment. "Give me my weapon right now, or I'll have you arrested for assault on a royal guard," he demanded. But his voice lacked conviction. The presence of so many witnesses, including people with influence and authority, was making him nervous. Maria looked around at the faces in the crowd. She saw fear, but she also saw something else: anticipation. These people had lived under the thumb of corrupt officials and abusive authorities for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to see someone fight back. Her simple act of defiance was awakening something in them. "I'll return your rifle," Maria said. "But first I want you to apologize to that elderly man you hurt." I want you to explain to all these people why you think it's acceptable to abuse citizens who have done nothing wrong." The other royal guards exchanged nervous glances. This was not covered in their training manual. They were supposed to deal with terrorists, assassins, and organized threats to the royal family. Nobody had taught them how to handle a school teacher, demanding an apology on behalf of the people. Lieutenant Morrison could hear the royal procession getting closer. The ceremonial drums were louder now, and he could make out the sound of the crowd cheering from several blocks away. In less than 10 minutes, the king's carriage would reach the plaza, and there would be no way to hide what had happened here. "You're making a huge mistake," Morrison told Maria through gritted teeth. "When this is over, you're going to prison for a very long time. Assaulting a royal guard is a serious crime, and theft of military weapons carries a life sentence." But Maria had moved beyond fear. Something had awakened in her that went deeper than concern for her own safety. She thought about her students, many of whom came from families that had suffered under corrupt officials. She thought about her father, who had spent 2 years in prison for demanding fair treatment from tax collectors. She thought about all the time she had stayed silent when she should have spoken up. "The only crime I see here," Maria replied, "is a drunk man in uniform abusing the power that belongs to the people, not to him." She gestured toward the elderly man, who was still standing nearby despite the danger. "This gentleman has probably paid taxes his whole life to support the royal guard. He has the right to watch his king's procession without being pushed around by someone who's supposed to protect him." The crowd began to murmur their agreement. Someone shouted, "She's right." Another voice called out, "Make him apologize." The mood was shifting from fear to something that made the royal guards increasingly nervous. What had started as a simple confrontation was beginning to look like the seeds of a rebellion. At that moment, Captain Rodriguez, the senior officer in charge of plaza security, arrived on the scene. He had been coordinating with other units when reports reached him about a disturbance involving Lieutenant Morrison. What he saw when he pushed through the crowd made his blood run cold. One of his men had been disarmed by a civilian in front of hundreds of witnesses, many of whom were now openly supporting the woman who had done it. The royal procession was minutes away, and instead of a secure, orderly crowd, he was looking at a powder keg ready to explode. Captain Rodriguez was a career military man who had worked his way up through the ranks over 20 years. Unlike many of his subordinates, he had not forgotten that the Royal Guard's primary duty was to serve the people, not to lord over them. He had heard rumors about Lieutenant Morrison's drinking and his treatment of civilians, but he had never seen direct evidence before. "Lieutenant Morrison," Captain Rodriguez said in a voice that cut through the noise of the crowd, "report to me immediately." His tone made it clear that Morrison was in serious trouble. The lieutenant reluctantly approached his superior, leaving Maria still holding the rifle but no longer surrounded by weapons pointed at her. Captain Rodriguez looked at the rifle in Maria's hands, then at the crowd, then back at his disgraced subordinate. "Lieutenant, you will explain to me right now why this civilian has your weapon, and why there are hundreds of people here who seem to think you've done something wrong." Before Morrison could answer, several people in the crowd began shouting their accounts of what they had witnessed. The elderly man stepped forward, supported by 2 younger women, and told Captain Rodriguez exactly what had happened. Other witnesses confirmed the story, and someone mentioned that the whole incident had been recorded on camera. Captain Rodriguez felt his career prospects crumbling. The royal procession would arrive in minutes, and he had a public relations disaster on his hands that could reach the highest levels of government. But as he looked at Maria Santos, still holding the rifle and standing with quiet dignity despite the chaos around her, he realized that something more important than careers was at stake. Captain Rodriguez made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of immediately demanding the weapon back and arresting Maria, he turned to Lieutenant Morrison and said in a voice loud enough for nearby witnesses to hear, "Lieutenant, you are relieved of duty pending a full investigation. Remove your insignia and report to headquarters immediately." The crowd fell silent, shocked by this unexpected turn of events. Maria felt the heavy rifle trembling in her hands, not from fear now, but from the realization that her actions had triggered something much larger than she had anticipated. Lieutenant Morrison's face went pale as he understood that his career was over. Sir, you can't believe these people over your own man, Morrison protested. This woman assaulted me and stole military property. She should be the one under arrest. But even as he spoke, he was removing the insignia from his uniform, his hands shaking with anger and humiliation. Captain Rodriguez looked at Maria with curious respect. Ma'am, I'm Captain Rodriguez. I need you to return that weapon to me, and then I need to understand exactly what happened here. His tone was firm but not threatening, and Maria sensed that this man was different from Lieutenant Morrison, as Maria carefully handed over the rifle, making sure to keep it pointed away from everyone. Captain Rodriguez noticed her proper handling of the weapon despite her obvious unfamiliarity with firearms. Have you had military training? He asked. No, sir, Maria replied. I'm a school teacher. I've never held a gun before today. Her honesty impressed him, and he could see the sincerity in her eyes. This was not a troublemaker or revolutionary. This was an ordinary citizen who had been pushed too far. The sound of the royal procession was now very close, and Captain Rodriguez knew he had minutes to restore order. But the crowd had grown to several hundred people, and their mood had shifted from fear to something resembling hope. They had seen one of their own stand up to authority, and not only survive, but apparently prevail. Carlos Mendez approached Captain Rodriguez, his press credentials visible. Captain, I'm a journalist, and I've recorded this entire incident. The public has a right to know what happened here, and I think you'll find that this woman acted with remarkable restraint and courage. Captain Rodriguez examined the credentials and nodded. I want a copy of that recording for the investigation, he said. Then he turned back to Maria. Ma'am, I need your name and contact information. You'll need to give a full statement about today's events. Maria Santos, she replied, giving her address and phone number. But I want to know what's going to happen to me. Am I under arrest? The question that had been gnawing at her finally came out, and she braced herself for the answer. That depends on the investigation, Captain Rodriguez said honestly. But based on what I've seen and heard here today, I don't think you'll be facing any charges. In fact, you may have done the Royal Guard a service by exposing problems we need to address. At that moment, the first elements of the royal procession came into view at the far end of the plaza. The crowd's attention was divided between the approaching ceremony and the drama that had just unfolded. Captain Rodriguez quickly deployed his remaining guards to create a proper security corridor, but he kept thinking about what had happened. As the royal carriages passed through the plaza, Maria found herself in a surreal situation. She was standing in the same spot where just minutes earlier she had disarmed a royal guard. Now she was watching the king and queen pass by, their ornate carriage glittering with gold and precious stones, their faces serene and distant. The elderly man she had helped approached her as the procession continued past. Thank you, he said simply, tears in his eyes. In 60 years, I've never seen anyone stand up to them like that. You've given us hope that things can change. Other people began approaching Maria, shaking her hand, thanking her, asking for her name so they could tell their families about what they had witnessed. She felt overwhelmed by the attention and the weight of what she had done. All she had wanted was to help an old man who had been pushed down. She never intended to become a symbol of resistance. Captain Rodriguez watched these interactions with growing concern. He realized that Maria Santos had inadvertently become a folk hero, and folk heroes could be dangerous to established authority if they weren't handled carefully. At the same time, he was a decent man who recognized that justice had been served today, even if it hadn't come through official channels. After the royal procession had passed and the crowd began to disperse, Captain Rodriguez approached Maria again. Mrs. Santos, I want you to know that your actions today, while irregular, were not without merit. Lieutenant Morrison has been a problem for some time, and you've forced us to address issues we should have dealt with long ago. Maria felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Does this mean I won't go to prison? She asked. I can't make any guarantees, the captain replied, but I will make sure that your side of the story is fully heard. What you did today took tremendous courage, and I don't think the Royal Guard should be in the business of punishing citizens for showing courage in defense of others. As Maria walked home that afternoon, her grandmother's basket still in her hand but forgotten groceries never purchased, she had no idea how dramatically her life was about to change. Carlos Mendez's video of the incident would be uploaded to the internet within hours. By evening, news stations would be running the story of the school teacher who disarmed a royal guard to defend an elderly citizen. The video would go viral overnight, viewed by millions of people around the world. Maria Santos would become an international symbol of peaceful resistance to authority abuse. But she would also become a target for those who saw her actions as a dangerous challenge to the established order. Her phone began ringing before she even reached home. Reporters, government officials, and civil rights activists all wanted to speak with her. The quiet life of a school teacher was over forever, replaced by something she never wanted and didn't understand how to handle. As she sat in her small apartment that evening watching her own face on the news, Maria realized that her moment of standing up for what was right had consequences she couldn't have imagined. The real test of her courage was just beginning. The morning after the incident, Maria woke up to find her apartment building surrounded by news vans and reporters. The video of her confrontation with Lieutenant Morrison had been shared millions of times on social media platforms around the world. News networks were calling it the teacher's stand and David versus Goliath in the digital age. Maria's phone had been ringing constantly since dawn. Producers from international news shows wanted interviews. Publishers offered book deals. Political activists invited her to speak at rallies. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had lived quietly for 32 years, teaching children and caring for her elderly mother. But the attention wasn't all positive. Maria also received threatening phone calls from people who saw her actions as an attack on law and order. Anonymous voices warned her to keep quiet if she knew what was good for her. Some callers used language so vicious that Maria had to turn off her phone and unplug her landline. Captain Rodriguez arrived at her building around noon, pushing through the crowd of reporters to reach her door. When Maria let him in, she could see the stress on his face. "Mrs. Santos," he said, "we need to talk about your safety. Some very powerful people are not happy about what happened yesterday." Maria poured him coffee with shaking hands. "I just wanted to help an old man," she said. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I don't want to be famous or cause trouble for anyone." "I believe you," Captain Rodriguez replied, "but this situation has moved beyond your intentions. My investigation into Lieutenant Morrison has revealed problems that go much deeper than one drunk guard. There are people who would prefer those problems stay hidden." Over the next hour, Captain Rodriguez explained what he had discovered. Lieutenant Morrison's drinking was just the tip of the iceberg. Several royal guards had been taking bribes from criminals, allowing drug dealers and smugglers to operate freely in exchange for money. Others had been using their positions to extort local business owners, threatening them with false arrests if they didn't pay protection money. The corruption went beyond individual guards to their supervisors, who had been covering up misconduct reports for years. Captain Rodriguez had found evidence that some high-ranking officials in the Royal Guard hierarchy knew about the abuse and chose to ignore it rather than deal with the scandal. "Your actions yesterday," the captain told Maria, "have forced us to investigate all of this. But there are people who have been making a lot of money from this corruption, and they're not going to give up without a fight." Maria felt sick as she realized the scope of what her simple act of defiance had uncovered. "What does this mean for me?" she asked. "It means you're in danger," Captain Rodriguez said bluntly. "But it also means you might be the key to cleaning up a system that's been rotten for too long. I'm here to ask you to consider working with our Internal Affairs Division to expose the full extent of this corruption." Before Maria could answer, there was a knock at her door. Through the peephole, she could see a well-dressed woman with official credentials. Captain Rodriguez checked the identification and let in Detective Sarah Chen from the National Corruption Investigation Unit. Detective Chen wasted no time with pleasantries. "Mrs. Santos, your video has triggered the largest investigation into Royal Guard corruption in the country's history. We've been trying to build cases against these people for Years, but witnesses were too afraid to come forward. Your courage yesterday has given others the strength to speak up. She opened a briefcase filled with documents and photographs. In the past 18 hours, we've received over 200 reports of Royal Guard misconduct. People are calling our hotlines, sending emails, even showing up at police stations with evidence they've been hiding for years. Maria looked at the stack of papers, each one representing someone who had suffered abuse at the hands of those sworn to protect them. She saw photos of beaten protesters, documentation of illegal searches, records of missing evidence in criminal cases involving wealthy defendants. "We need you to testify," Detective Chen continued. "Your incident was recorded and witnessed by hundreds of people, making it impossible for officials to cover up or deny. If you're willing to stand up in court the same way you stood up in that plaza, we can use your case as the foundation for prosecuting dozens of corrupt officials." Maria felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She looked at Captain Rodriguez, who nodded encouragingly. "These are good people, Mrs. Santos. They're trying to do the right thing just like you did." But Maria was thinking about her students, her elderly mother, her quiet life that had been turned upside down. "What if I say no?" she asked. "What if I just want to go back to teaching and forget this ever happened?" Detective Chen's expression grew serious. "Mrs. Santos, I need to be honest with you. Even if you try to walk away from this, the people involved in this corruption aren't going to forget about you. They see you as a threat to their operations, and threats don't usually just disappear." The detective showed Maria a folder containing surveillance photos taken outside her apartment building, her school, and her mother's house. These pictures were taken by people working for some very dangerous individuals. Whether you cooperate with us or not, you're already in their crosshairs. Maria studied the photos, feeling a chill run down her spine. She could see unfamiliar faces watching her daily routines, noting when she left for work, when she visited her mother, where she bought groceries. Her privacy was already gone, and her safety was already compromised. "If I help you," Maria asked, "what kind of protection can you provide?" "Full witness protection if necessary," Detective Chen replied. "New identity, relocation, financial support, but we're hoping it won't come to that. We believe that by exposing this corruption publicly and prosecuting the people involved, we can actually make you safer in the long run." Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mrs. Santos, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday in the plaza. You asked why we thought it was acceptable to abuse citizens who had done nothing wrong. That question has been haunting me, because I realize I've been part of a system that allowed this abuse to continue." He paused, clearly struggling with his emotions. "I joined the Royal Guard 20 years ago because I wanted to serve my country and protect my people. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that mission. Yesterday, a school teacher had to remind me what honor and courage actually look like." Maria looked at both officials, then at the evidence of corruption spread across her coffee table. She thought about the elderly man she had helped, about her students who deserved to grow up in a world where authority figures could be trusted, about her father who had sacrificed so much fighting against injustice. Slowly, she nodded. "I'll help you," she said. "But I want guarantees about my mother's safety, and I want updates on every step of the investigation. If I'm going to risk everything for this, I need to know it's going to make a real difference." Detective Chen smiled for the first time since arriving. "Mrs. Santos, I can guarantee you that this investigation is going to change everything. Your courage has already started a revolution." 6 months after that fateful morning in Central Plaza, Maria Santos stood in a federal courtroom as the prosecution's star witness in the largest corruption trial in the country's history. The months between her decision to cooperate and this moment had been the most challenging of her life, but also the most meaningful. The investigation that began with her simple act of defiance had uncovered a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of the Royal Guard command structure. 14 high-ranking officials had been arrested, including Lieutenant Morrison's direct superior, who had been taking bribes to cover up misconduct reports for over 5 years. The evidence was overwhelming. Detective Chen's team had discovered bank accounts filled with bribe money, recordings of officials planning cover-ups, and documentation of dozens of cases where evidence had been destroyed to protect wealthy criminals. The elderly man Maria had helped, whose name was Roberto Vasquez, had become the symbol of all the innocent victims who had suffered under this corrupt system. Maria's testimony was clear and powerful. She described exactly what she had witnessed. Speaking in the same straightforward manner that had made her such an effective teacher, the defense attorneys tried to portray her as a troublemaker who had assaulted a royal guard. But the video evidence and the testimony of hundreds of witnesses made their arguments impossible to maintain. Lieutenant Morrison himself had become a key witness for the prosecution. Facing a potential life sentence, he had agreed to testify against his superiors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the systematic nature of the corruption, describing how new guards were gradually introduced to illegal activities, and how those who refused to participate were transferred to undesirable assignments or forced out of the service entirely. Captain Rodriguez had also testified, describing how he had tried to report misconduct several times over the years, only to have his reports buried or dismissed. His emotional testimony about how the Royal Guard had lost its way resonated with the jury and the public following the trial. The most dramatic moment came when Maria was cross-examined by the defense team representing the highest-ranking defendant, General Marcus Webb, the former commander of the Royal Guard Security Division. Webb's lawyer, an expensive attorney named Harrison Clark, attempted to discredit Maria by suggesting she had planned the entire incident as a publicity stunt. "Mrs. Santos," Clark said in his most intimidating voice, "isn't it true that you went to that plaza specifically looking for trouble? That you had decided in advance to confront the Royal Guards?" Maria looked directly at him, drawing on the same inner strength that had carried her through that morning 6 months ago. "Mr. Clark, I went to the plaza to buy vegetables for my dinner. I had no plan except to help an old man who was being hurt by someone who was supposed to protect him." Clark tried a different approach. "You've become quite famous from this incident, haven't you? Book deals, speaking engagements, interviews on television. Hasn't this been quite profitable for you?" The question stung because it contained a grain of truth. Maria had indeed received offers for book deals and speaking engagements, though she had turned most of them down. The media attention had been overwhelming, and she struggled with the fact that her private life had become public property. "I never wanted any of this attention," Maria replied honestly. "I gave up my teaching job because reporters were disrupting my classroom. I've had to move 3 times because of death threats. If I could trade all the attention to go back to my quiet life, I would do it in a heartbeat." Her sincerity was evident to everyone in the courtroom. Clark realized his strategy was backfiring, making Maria appear even more sympathetic to the jury. He quickly changed tactics, but the damage was done. The trial lasted 3 months, with testimony from over 50 witnesses. Carlos Mendez, the journalist who had filmed the original incident, testified about the importance of documenting police misconduct. Roberto Vasquez, the elderly man Maria had helped, gave emotional testimony about his gratitude and his years of suffering similar abuse in silence. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Maria's students. Despite the disruption to their education, many of them had written letters supporting their former teacher. Several were called to testify about how Maria had taught them to stand up to bullies and fight for what was right. One student, a shy 12-year-old named Anna, told the court through tears, "Miss Santos always told us that good people have to speak up when bad things happen, even if it's scary. She didn't just teach us that, she showed us how to do it." When the verdicts were announced, the courtroom erupted in cheers. General Webb was sentenced to 15 years in prison for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Lieutenant Morrison received 5 years but would be eligible for parole in 3. 12 other defendants received sentences ranging from 2 to 10 years. More importantly, the trial had forced a complete reorganization of the Royal Guard. New leadership was installed, with Captain Rodriguez promoted to head the reformed Internal Affairs Division. Strict new procedures were implemented for handling misconduct reports, and regular independent audits were established to prevent future corruption. The changes went beyond the Royal Guard. The trial had sparked a national conversation about accountability in law enforcement and government institutions. Citizens who had previously been afraid to report misconduct began coming forward in record numbers. Reform movements gained momentum across the country, with Maria's story serving as inspiration for people who had never before found the courage to speak out. For Maria herself, the aftermath was bittersweet. She had achieved something remarkable. She had helped dismantle a corrupt system and made her country a little more just. But the personal cost had been enormous. The death threats continued, though they were less frequent. Her relationship with her longtime boyfriend had ended under the pressure of constant media attention. She could no longer live anonymously in her hometown. Detective Chen had kept her promise about witness protection, and Maria was eventually able to start a new life in a different city under a modified identity. She returned to teaching, though at a school where her past was known only to the principal and a few trusted colleagues. Her students knew her simply as Mrs. Silva, a dedicated teacher who seemed to have an unusual passion for civics lessons, about standing up for what's right. On quiet evenings, Maria sometimes thought about that morning in Central Plaza and wondered if she would make the same choice again, knowing what she knew now about the consequences. The answer always came back the same. She would do it again because some things were more important than personal comfort or safety. The elderly man, Roberto Vasquez, stayed in touch with Maria through carefully managed channels. In his last letter he wrote, "You gave me back my dignity that day, but more than that, you gave all of us hope that ordinary people can make extraordinary changes when they find the courage to act." 3 years after the incident, a small monument was erected in Central Plaza, not far from where Maria had confronted Lieutenant Morrison. It bears a simple inscription, in honor of all citizens who find the courage to speak truth to power. Maria had never seen it in person, but she had heard about it from friends who understood that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who never wanted to be heroes at all. The Royal Guard had been reformed, corrupt officials had been punished, and citizens felt safer in their interactions with authority figures. Maria Santos had achieved something remarkable through one moment of moral courage, proving that sometimes a single person standing up for what's right can change an entire system. But perhaps the most important legacy of her actions was the lesson she had taught through example, that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to accept injustice, even when fighting back seems impossible. Her story became a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite the fear. As she continued her quiet life as a teacher in her new city, Maria carried with her the knowledge that she had made a difference. When her students faced bullies or witnessed unfairness, she could teach them not just about the importance of standing up for others, but about how to find the strength to actually do it when the moment comes.